ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೆ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಪ್ರೊಫೆಸರ್ ಚೆಂಗಪ್ಪ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. Good afternoon, one and all. I will firstly introduce the esteemed panelists to the audience. Ambassador Ruchira Kamboj on my left is a distinguished officer of the 1987 batch of the Indian Foreign Service and the All India Women's Topper of that year's Civil Services exam. Has built a groundbreaking diplomatic career defined by several firsts. She served as India's first female permanent representative to the United Nations in New York until May 2024, where she led key initiatives and made history in December 2022 by becoming the first Indian woman to preside over the United Nations Security Council. Her trailblazing path includes being India's first female ambassador to Bhutan, High Commissioner to South Africa, and permanent representative to UNESCO in Paris, each role marked by significant contributions to India's strategic and cultural diplomacy. From 2011 to 2014, she served as India's first woman chief of protocol, overseeing high-level diplomatic engagements that enhanced India's global profile. Earlier in her career, she held key postings in Paris, Mauritius, New York, and Cape Town. And from 2009 to 2011, she was seconded to the Commonwealth Secretariat in London as a staff officer to the Secretary General. Ambassador Kamboj's career reflects a consistent record of leadership, excellence, and pioneering service in Indian diplomacy. Welcome you, Ambassador, to the program this afternoon. On my right is Dr. Swasti Rao, who is a geopolitics and defense expert, commentator, and author. She is currently Associate Professor, Jindal School of International Affairs, Jindal Global University, and a consulting editor, Strategic and International Affairs for India's leading media house, The Print. She is also a geopolitical and defense advisor to the Ministry of Defense, Government of India for its flagship project, the UP Defense Industrial Corridor. Additionally, she is a non-resident fellow at Eastern Circles, Paris, a regular commentator on international relations across national and international media. She writes a weekly experts column for The Print. She has been representing India at the flagship EU, European Union Security Dialogue, the Schuman Forum held at the European Parliament at Brussels since March 2023, among other international fora. She was earlier a fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, a premier think tank under the Ministry of Defense, where she worked on projects for the PMO, MEA, and Ministry of Defense on European geopolitics, including India's defense cooperation with Western partners. For her work on the Russia-Ukraine war, she has been honored by the Indian Air Force in 2024. The French Senate honored her in 2025 for her contributions to India-France defense cooperation and strategic partnership. She is affiliated with the EU-India Women's Council and serves as a reviewer for the peer-reviewed publications by the National Maritime Foundation, India, and the Royal United Services Institute, London. An alumnus of JNU, India, Tsukuba University, Japan, and some fancy institute in France, which is not pronounceable. She is a recipient of the prestigious Japanese Education Ministry Fellowship in 2011 and the Okita Memorial Scholarship in 2010 from ICCR. Okay. That was quite a mouthful. Yeah, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to this platform and sharing my views with you, and more importantly, the views of the panelists. I am just going to make some introductory remarks and then keep quiet. That's what my limited mandate in this session is. I'll stand at the podium. Yeah, so as the MC mentioned a little while ago, uh, the session is India's challenging neighborhood, the role of extra-regional powers. So let me begin by decoding the title of this talk. In international politics, geographical proximity does not necessarily translate into political harmony, and, and the situation in South Asia corroborates with this situation. Now, when we speak of India's challenging neighborhood, we are referring to South Asia, a region which constitutes countries which share common borders with common land and maritime boundaries with India, namely Pakistan to our northwest and China to our northeast, followed by Bhutan and Nepal, the two erstwhile Himalayan kingdoms, and Bangladesh on the east, and Myanmar at the extreme east. Now, while I add China to the neighborhood, China is not typically a South Asian power and doesn't sort of fit into India's neighborhood in the sense that China is different, but it's trying hard to blend in. Ethnically, linguistically, and culturally, China is different. All the smaller nations of South Asia are a people who are deeply religious, as against modern China or post-Mao China from 1949, which is shaped by atheistic or godless communism. Now, China has entrenched itself in a big way in the neighborhood. Investments in Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka and Maldives, and Bangladesh, of course. So this is worrisome to our national security and foreign policy planners in New Delhi. China's expanding economic and political footprint in the region. Now, apart from disputed borders, land borders, there's a deeper problem that makes India's neighborhood that much more challenging. And that has to do with the anti-India sentiment prevalent in all these neighbors, among all these smaller neighbors. The political elite of these countries, whether they are elected democracies or inherited rulers, especially in the erstwhile Himalayan kingdoms like Bhutan and Nepal, they all, nurture a sort of anti-India sentiment. And that is a deeper problem that is worrisome for India. They play the China card against India, and that is where the extra-regional powers comes into the picture. Besides, there is a clear imbalance in the region, the South Asian subcontinent, namely India in terms of size of military, size of territory, and size of economy, and the population is far more preponderant a power than its smaller neighbors. And this asymmetry, instead of being perceived positively, has become a negative, has evolved into a negative perception. The smaller neighbors no longer view India as a market. They view it as a big power which is difficult to manage. Now, as everybody knows, economics unites and politics divides. The absence of economic integration in South Asia is a big challenge. South Asian countries tend to trade more with distant regions than with each other. Take the case of India-Pakistan trade. Pakistan's security bureaucracy fears free trade with India simply because it will promote people-to-people relationship, and the state-to-state relations get diluted. Besides, political instability characterizes our neighborhood. Pakistan, a couple of years ago, even now, Bangladesh, and the latest domino is Nepal. It's difficult for Indian industry to invest in the neighborhood. Now, I remember when I was Delhi-based years ago, I met the chairman of Camco, which is a very local setup. He had just come back from Pakistan trying to sell his products there. And I remember chatting with him about the whole thing for a bit. Now, the Chinese involvement in the neighborhood is one factor that I pointed out as an extra regional power. And then it's a no-brainer to guess which is the other power. The United States, which is sort of a global policeman with about 750 odd foreign military bases, and its persistent foreign military sales to Pakistan. The latest case being after Operation Sindoor, the International Monetary Federation gave Pakistan a bailout. So the United States and China are very Pakistan focused, and India therefore has a very challenging neighborhood. Now, why is this neighborhood so challenging? Why are India's smaller neighbors so, why do they nurture this anti-India sentiment? This has its historical reasons, in the sense that most of India, some of India's smaller neighbors were once part of a larger Indian empire, and others emerged as political entities in the larger Indian civilization. And over the years, they had difficulty in trying to formulate their national identity, and it became a national identity which was anti-Indian. And this anti-Indian identity also helped them to mobilize domestic political forces against their opposition parties. And in the process, India has become what you call a regional policeman, sometimes hated, sometimes loved, but geography is something you can't avoid. It's like relatives and neighbors. You have to tolerate them if you don't like them. So with these few words, I'll hand over the discussions to Ambassador Kamboj and Dr. Swasti Rao. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here, and wonderful to see all of you here in this very beautiful city, which is a first for me, first time that I'm visiting Bangalore, and I look forward to engaging and interacting with you. While the stage has been set and our moderator has set the tone, what I want to say is something somewhat different. When we speak of India's challenging neighborhood, I don't believe that we are necessarily only talking about geography or about borders. We're also talking about systems, about flows of thank you. We're also talking about systems of flows of technology, capital, data, and influence. Technology, finance, data, and influence. What affects neighbors today often comes from far away. Power is exercised through systems, as I've already mentioned, not just soldiers. So what I'm trying to say is that extra-regional powers are not just present in our neighborhood. They are embedded into supply chains, into decision cycles, and information flows. And India's challenge, what is India's challenge, you might ask me? I would say that India's challenge is not to resist this reality. They're already there, the extra-regional powers, but to shape it so that proximity becomes leverage and not a liability. Now, let me frame this around three structural shifts. First, warfare. Warfare has been democratized. It's not just about big nations, large armies, and soldiers. It's about precision. It's about drones, cyber tools, and data. These very often travel faster than political signaling. And so, therefore, escalation is no longer something you manage after the fact. It unfolds in real time. The second shift, economic security has fused with national security. So rare earths, chips, ports, and now data centers and cloud corridors are strategic terrain. You control the upstream and you shape downstream choices. Simple example. If I control the paths, I control what you can build. It's a choke point power. And third, the region is being pulled by competing spheres of influence, sometimes described as hemispheres, but experienced locally as pressure to choose sides. Now, let me start with the battlefield because it increasingly sets the terms of diplomacy. Across conflicts today, we see cross-cutting defense value chains, commercial drones, dual-use components, satellite services, encrypted communications, and AI-enabled targeting. Now, in our own context, let's look at Operation Sindoor, something you're all very familiar with, and underline three realities. First, escalation management is compressed. Decision cycles shrink when drones, loitering munitions, and air defense systems operate simultaneously. Second, the narrative layer is operational. Diplomacy, deterrence, and disinformation now run in parallel, not sequentially. And third, indigenization equals survivability. This is no longer a slogan because India's leadership has explicitly linked DRDO-developed systems to operational outcomes and described the emerging doctrine as a new normal in counter-terrorism responses. So I would say here that the extra-regional factor here is not simply who supplies the weapons. It is who controls upstream technology, satellite access, cyber layers, sanctions leverage, insurance, and finance behind the conflict. The second shift is the weaponization of economic interdependence. Now, rare earths and critical minerals are no longer just inputs. They are instruments of statecraft. Choke magnets or choke motors and U-shape strategic choices elsewhere. All of you have been following, I'm sure, the recent Japan-China frictions over export controls. And I think this illustrates this very clearly. The International Energy Agency has warned that such controls undermine diversification and delay downstream manufacturing, especially for developing economies. Now add the next frontier, which is data centers. As AI scales, data centers are no longer neutral infrastructure. They are energy hungry, network dependent, politically exposed strategic assets. Increasingly, scholars treat digital infrastructure as part of weaponized interdependence. And this is where our neighborhood matters. Developing countries provide minerals, land, energy and connectivity corridors. And so therefore, I would say the question is very stark. Do we remain sites of extraction and hosting, or do we bargain for value addition, standards, skill, and security guarantees? So, are we just hosts, or are we partners? Let me now move on to three neighborhood cases. Our moderator spoke about Pakistan, he spoke about Bangladesh, he also spoke about Bhutan. Pakistan reminds us how deterrence now operates in compressed timeframes. During Sindoor, external perceptions and pressure became part of the conflict environment, something the MEA, as you all know, addressed directly in Parliament. Bangladesh, on the other hand, shows how domestic transitions become internationalized. Political change creates vacuum moments, and extra-regional actors move quickly with finance, with narratives, and security ties. Now, the point is not to over-interpret foreign meddling, but to recognize that internal flux invites external play. And Bhutan, by contrast, a country where I served as ambassador, where I had the honor to serve as ambassador, provides the counterpoint. It shows what stability looks like when built on trust, when built on connectivity and sovereignty, respecting partnerships. Now, very recently, as all of you know, the Prime Minister was in Bhutan and he announced a very exciting connectivity project whereby the whole of southern Bhutan would be linked to the larger rail network of India, thereby ensuring enhanced connectivity between, of course, goods, trade, and people. And this would, in turn, reduce transaction costs for Bhutan's growth. So this is an example, as I said, a counterpoint, how you quietly outcompete coercive influence by shrinking the space for external capture. And Bhutan is an excellent example. Very recently, you would have also noted that one of our leading business houses was in southern Bhutan in the Gellifu Mindfulness City project and has come on board as a founder member. Now, this means a lot for Bhutan because this is a project of tremendous promise for the kingdom, and India coming on board as a founding member ensures that vital space is taken by India in our immediate neighborhood. So these were three examples. Looking ahead, what should India do in this challenging neighborhood? Well, I would say three things: deliver, partner, and link systems. Now, as far as delivery goes, you continue to do what you're doing. You continue to power the trade, you share your digital public infrastructure, you are there for disaster response, for health security, remember COVID-19, skilling, resilient supply chains. These expand choices actually for neighbors rather than constrain them. And number two, partner. Well-designed partnerships or minilaterals with credible partners. De-risk projects, improve transparency, and offer neighbors alternatives without pressure. And a very good example of this is the Trincomalee Energy Hub in Sri Lanka, where three countries, Sri Lanka is the host, UAE brings in the finance and capital, and India brings in its infrastructure expertise. So this is an example of triangular cooperation within our challenging neighborhood. And third, think in terms of a neighborhood economic security compact. And what do I mean by that? Link minerals to manufacturing, energy to data and compute, and logistics to standards. So as I conclude, I am concluding my presentation. I would say that India's neighborhood today is shaped less by borders or geography and more by systems of flows of capital, finance, infrastructure, data, influence. Extra-regional powers matter because they embed themselves into these flows. They don't arrive as flags. They embed themselves in these flows. Now, what about India's response? Well, as I've said, it cannot be rhetoric. It cannot even be nostalgia. It must be credible. And what is that? The capacity to deter without escalation, to deliver growth as we have been doing, and to partner without necessarily demanding alignment. And if we do this well, geography stops being a vulnerability and becomes India's strongest strategic leverage. Thank you.
Well, a very good afternoon to everybody here. It's such an honor to be here at the Mangalore Literature Festival. Thank you, Vijay, for giving me this opportunity. And well, I mean, I think especially since Ambassador Kamboj has probably said everything that is worth mentioning about India's neighborhood, I really am trying to understand what exactly should I be saying. But anyway, I'll try my best. Thank you, Dr. Bidanda, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Dean, for being here. Ambassador Tirumurthy, it's so great to know people who have flown with me from Delhi. I think, Smita, we were together on the flight yesterday. Yes. So, well, it's great to be among people that we know. So, quickly, you know, just building on what Ambassador Kamboj just said, because every single word she mentioned there is absolutely true. I'll just try to sort of, you know, tell you a big picture and then sort of fine-tune a bit to share some research that I have been doing that I think is very crucial for how we should be engaging the neighborhood and where the neighborhood is going. I'm sure everybody understands there is a world disorder. Everybody understands now that, you know, no matter of how much you would want to predict, there is no certainty that that prediction would be true. There is uncertainty. And always, you know, when we are talking about engaging the world, whether it's the neighborhood, which is a logic of geography, which also comes with challenges of geography and then also opportunities of geography. So it depends on how you are going to be looking at it. And Ambassador Kamboj already mentioned a few things in terms of how to have a systemic sort of approach to that. But however, any such external engagement, whether it's neighborhood, extended neighborhood, or the great power rivalry out there, I think the first thing where everybody will agree to that, is that external engagement or the capability to engage externally comes from how strong you are internally. And I cannot overstate the fact that with whatever is going on in the world, I think that one big question mark on how does India really do the work that it requires to be done domestically, the internal reforms, the trade reforms, you know, so many things are happening thanks to Donald Trump, of course, because he has made everybody's life difficult. So I think that's the one thing that I need to really drive home, that the capacity to engage externally has to delve on how strengthened you are internally, which is a work in progress. And nothing like a very unpredictable, uncertain world order to really bring that mirror up to us again and again. So that's one. The second is that the global militarization is here to stay. We are living in extremely dangerous times. That's the second thing. And something very important, you know why? Because I remember, you know, in Delhi, that's very fashionable to be parts of these scenario building exercises. Many think tanks do it, a lot of foreign think tanks also do it. So I remember right before Operation Sindoor, we were a part of, you know, one such scenario building exercise in terms of what are going to be the challenges for Indo-Pacific and, you know, India's neighborhood, Indian Ocean region, etc. And you'd be surprised that the fact that we were not spending even 2% of our GDP on defense was not really something which was a priority. Of course, there were other points which were priority. Urban development, infrastructure development, etc. You know, how do you develop better connectivity in your neighborhood, all very valid points, but nobody really thought about how this global militarization, which is happening in Ukraine, which is happening in Middle East, and now in Latin America and other parts of the world, is actually going to play out in our own neighborhood, okay? And it took us an Operation Sindoor to really understand that we cannot really go on talking about it. We need to deliver on that, because as we are speaking, let's just remind ourselves that while the United States happens to be, of course, the leading global military spender with almost $1 trillion worth of defense budget, back home, closer home, China has about $250 to $300 billion, depending on how you calculate their defense spending, which surpasses all the defense spending put together by India, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So that is the magnitude of what we are handling. And it is not just China with whom we are trying to have a rapprochement, which is obviously, I think Dr. Chauliya also alluded to that. But the fact that China is playing a very active role when, you know, we saw in with Pakistan and with Bangladesh as well. So I'm going to, you know, so the global militarization, and that we need to take it very, very seriously and never lose sight of that. The other thing is that there's no doubt about the fact that when we talk about global trends, Ambassador Kamboj mentioned the cross-cutting of defense value chains. I'm very happy you mentioned that, because I think not enough attention is paid to it. And I'll quickly tell you what it means. So the cross-cutting of defense value chains basically means that today, as United States doesn't have the capability to really project itself as a global policeman, even if it wanted to, I mean, regardless of Donald Trump's brashness, it doesn't have the capabilities to really play that game. And as it is sort of by design or by default, sort of retreating from that position of a global policeman, what is coming in its place is not that that entire security provider paradigm is usurped by China alone. That's not the case. What is happening in its absence is that that vacuum is usurped not by one user, but actually a cross-cutting of defense value chains. And I'll give you a very good example to tell you why it matters for India. So you may be hearing a lot about the defense synergy between China and Pakistan. And just to take it further, so you know that China-Pakistan co-produced fighter jets, which are produced in Pakistan and being exported to Azerbaijan, have Turkish missiles on them. That is cross-cutting defense value chains, which is that it's not one power that comes with an end-user agreement. I give you an F-16 and I tell you where to use it. No, we are living in an era where middle-order powers are basically doing subsystems integration, pushing forward their comparative advantage in a very unethical, global society. Of course, global society has always been unethical, but especially now, and it becomes a challenge. You know why? Because we are living in the era of military tech leakage. So you do not know that the drone technology that we are so fond of talking about, once these wars end, and because there is so much of accumulation of all this military technology, how is this technical know-how being sold to actors that are hostile to us? I can give you a very good example in Afghanistan. We talk of Afghanistan, and again, coming closer to neighborhood, we talk of Afghanistan because we need strategic depth in Afghanistan to manage Pakistan. Now, this is an argument that we all know very well. So no point sort of reiterating that. Another reason why we want strategic depth in Afghanistan is also because we want to make sure that China doesn't sort of, dominate Afghanistan too much. And therefore, we all know that the China-Pakistan, Afghanistan trilateral framework has been meeting, and we try to give our own, complementarity, or let's say substitute that with how we want to connect it to our investments in Chabahar, by way of Iran, and also going unilaterally. But the more important part is that in Afghanistan, there is a thriving shadow economy, completely illicit, where from Russian arms to Iranian diesel, Iranian oil, to opium, all of that is transacted, and that is what has actually kept the country afloat. So when India has to sort of, surrounded by neighbors, of course I mentioned Afghanistan, and then of course coming closer home to Pakistan, we all know, I think Dr. Bidanta also alluded to the fact that just as we were trying to tell everybody the very obvious fact that Pakistan is the, sponsor of global terrorism, I mean, you saw that the IMF went ahead and, gave it the tranche that, basically it's the lifeline. That's how Pakistan sort of survives from one crisis to another. But what we need to study carefully, and I think that's the point that I wish to make, what we need to study carefully is that it is not just China. We have to keep an eye and ears open, especially when we are talking about the neighborhood. And this is building on what Ambassador Kamboj said. So infrastructure, yes. The fact that we are least integrated as a region, yes. India, by the way, does not need a SARC. So we have to stop also constantly talking about the failure of SARC because of India-Pakistan. India doesn't need a SARC to engage its neighbors. India is the one that, all its neighbors share the border with. It's not SARC, it's India. So if we are able to compartmentalize our foreign policy in a manner that we are able to sort of, really exploit that, that opportunity of geography, I think that is what we should be doing instead of saying that SARC is not working. Of course, SARC is not going to work, one. Second, so notwithstanding all of those infrastructural, points and all the triangular cooperation, she mentioned the Sri Lanka where India and UAE have come together, several African countries where India and France have come together, India and Germany have come together, very good points. I think very quickly, in order to develop these infrastructural projects, in order to develop our economic story, we really have to make sure that our borders are safe. And for that, of course, I think we are studying China, the role that China is playing in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. And China is the largest defense supplier to both these nations. The second country that I keep talking about again and again is Turkey. We do not study that country enough. Turkey is the second largest defense supplier to both Pakistan and Bangladesh. Turkish warships have visited Sri Lanka 6 times in 2025. Okay? It's not a small number. Turkey is the country with whom now Bangladesh is, planning to have, a kind of a special economic zone which is dedicated to defense, so like a defense ecosystem with Turkey. Those are things that we need to understand better. Why? Again, because it is not just about weapons or weapons platforms, it is about subsystems integration, and that is where the real danger lies. And I'll just end with a few things because I'm sure it's a technical thing and you might have questions on that, so I'm sort of just holding on to the examples so that if there are any questions later. But I'll just end with a few conclusions, which is that there is little doubt that we have to hedge our bets, okay? There's little doubt about that. How do we hedge our bets? And for that, I think I have, 2-3 recommendations for India. And this is particularly with regard to neighborhood. Of course, we can talk about other things. One is, of course, we need to get better at compartmentalizing our foreign policy. There may be troubles. It doesn't mean that we can't work together, because the whole point of foreign policy and diplomacy is to expand our convergences and minimize divergences. Second, yes, enter triangular cooperation. There may be a limit to how much India can really project in terms of giving away money. We don't come with deep pockets such as China, so this is a real challenge. Why is it that our neighbors are constantly picking China over India? Doesn't mean, and that brings me to the third point, that doesn't mean that they do not wish to diversify, because what we often forget is that just as we are multi-aligning, so are they multi-aligning. And as long as India is able to project itself as a valid, legit diversification partner, I think it's quite important, and Ambassador Kamboj also alluded to it. And finally, we have to accept that they also have a life, and there will be pro-India and anti-India factions, and I think India should be able to develop, and which we are doing, both in the case of Afghanistan, with the Taliban. It's been hugely criticized, but I think I've always said that this is what we need to do for our strategic interest. And then also now in Bangladesh, we see that we have to come to terms of the fact that this is what the people of Bangladesh want, and we should be able to sort of, deal with it. So with all of this, I think we'll be able to have a more performative neighborhood policy. But like I said, that none of this is going to make sense unless and until our own house is in order. And by our own house, basically what I mean to say is that our policy towards trade, our policy towards reform, our policy towards lessening the role of bureaucracy, it is a non-negotiable. So only when we have these two balances in place will we be able to have a better sense of how do we project ourselves as a more legit actor so that the neighborhood can engage. Because everywhere in the world, the great powers are creating ruckus. Whether it's their neighborhood, whether it's someone else's neighborhood. What happened in Venezuela lately is a very, very good point, which is not just about US's backyard, but also the fact that, China and Russia what were they doing so far away from their neighborhood, so basically the point is that great powers have always created that ruckus. We also live in a world where we cannot create these silos very, cleanly. And that's my last point, and it's also coming from my latest column. Because when I started to look into what was Donald Trump's rationale, let's say, for lack of a better term, for what he did in Venezuela, I started to unravel many more stories that made Venezuela what it was, which was that in today's complex world, we cannot really be looking at silos. Indo-Pacific is a silo which is separated from, let's say, another theater, or let's say European or the Arctic, and these are not silos. The Western Hemisphere is not a silo. Why? Because Venezuela was also a hub for a lot of Hezbollah activities. And that's what I've written about in my latest column, about how far these, undercurrents actually go. So we are dealing with a complex world. We are dealing with a world where a black and white kind of a scenario doesn't work. And therefore, we need to compartmentalize and up our game. Thank you.
Yeah. We would like to invite questions, comments, observations from the audience. Yeah, kindly keep it brief, not more than about 120 seconds. Thank you. Would the lady like to go first? Yeah.
Namaste. My question is there anything that we can do for our neighbor Bangladesh Hindus who are targeted badly nowadays, and it's like day and night they are killing Bangladesh Hindus? And we are in a situation, we can't tell them that come back to India. India is the highest populated nation. We can't do that.
Jai Hind, everyone. So my question is to.
One question at a time. Can the panelists respond? Good. You're a practitioner. We're all academics.
Well, I think the short answer to that is strategic restraint. And I think that is what India has been doing. And as you know, elections are around the corner, and India is in touch with all channels. And I'm sure that the political leadership of the day has a vision and a strategy.
I just want to add on to that. That's a very diplomatic answer, not saying too much, like a good MEA spokesperson, with due respect. I think if you are overpopulated, we can still accommodate them. We've accommodated Tibetan refugees, we've accommodated Rohingya refugees, and why not a few thousand or a couple of lakh more Bangladeshi Hindus? This is my personal view. Would you like to respond?
Jai Hind everyone.
No, I mean, there's little to respond to, but let's remember the 1971 war, you know, India took that decision that it did because there was a big question of what happens to the people that were getting killed there. So, I mean, I'm just saying that I kind of support this argument that people dying is not something that we should be just simply watching. Whether or not we're in a position to do something, I think I would be somewhere in the middle, saying that yes, we do need strategic restraint, because to what extent can we get involved with that? And on the other hand, I do not agree with the fact that we should just simply look away. I'm sorry, I don't adhere to that. We should do something about that.
Jai Hind everyone. My question is to Ambassador Kambod. How should India manage the growing influence of the extra-regional powers in its neighborhood without undermining the sovereignty of the smaller neighboring states? Thank you.
Well, let me break this into two parts. India's contribution to its neighborhood is already very strong. It's already very strong. You just look at India's track record with any of its neighbors. As a first responder, humanitarian and disaster relief, development projects, which by the way are demand-driven. India follows a very unique model. So if you look at any of the sectors, any of the countries, I think India is very engaged with its neighborhood, and of late, it is also there very, very speedily on time. So India's contribution to its neighborhood is already very strong. But going forward, I think what we should do is we should keep four aspects in mind, and it's already being done, but you make it a little bit more sharper, sort of a neighborhood 2.0. One is value. You bring to the neighbors what they truly want. And that is a policy we anyway follow, which is a demand-driven neighborhood policy. Number two, credibility. You have to be there steadily, quietly, consistently, which is again something that India has been doing, but that is also very important. Then I think you give them some options. And this is what I also touched upon in my address, that you use triangular partnerships where it works. Not ceremonially, but where it works. For example, I gave you one example in Sri Lanka. There could be other examples also. So you thereby expand options for your neighbors, and at the same time, from your end, from your perspective, you reduce the perception that you dominate. And I would say the fourth aspect is speed. You know, if you can get there very quickly in real time as any crisis breaks out, I think you bring greater credibility. As far as the neighborhood is concerned, let's be very clear. I think India brings unique inputs because of proximity and because of permanence. Look, we are in the neighborhood. We are living here. And so therefore we have very high stakes in all of this. And this is what I think, particularly in recent years, India has been doing, following a very strong, robust neighborhood first policy. But this is not to say that we cannot improve. I would say value, credibility, options, and speed should be the buzzwords.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just to supplement Ambassador's statement, you may recall in 2015 during the earthquake in Nepal, India was the first responder. Similarly, the 2004 tsunami, Indian warship, some INS, Indian naval warship was the first vessel. It's another matter that US Navy portrayed that it was much more larger than life in Sri Lanka. Would you like to add?
I mean, it's difficult to improve upon these very perfect answers, which are actually sort of covered everything. I think ultimately it is going to be a question of capabilities, frankly, because what we have seen in our experience, and this has been my reading as well, that everybody is hedging their bets. Okay, so we have to understand that when everybody, in an era where everybody is sort of exercising that multi-alignment with big powers and everybody, I mean, you also lose your comparative advantage. So unless and until this is about capabilities, I don't think we can take it far. Obviously, like I said, just as the logic of geography applies to us, the logic of geography applies to them. There is a limit to how much there is, so, it's kind of pretty much in vogue right now to talk about the Pakistan-Bangladesh warming up. Pakistan and Bangladesh are separated by India. India and Bangladesh share a 4,000 kilometer border. So if we are not able to sort of change that into that, it's logic, it's geography, nobody can wish it away. So if we are not able to capitalize on that, I mean, there is a limit to how much Pakistan and Bangladesh could do. Of course, there are different ways, and that's, if you want to know, I'll tell you what are the different ways in which they can do it. But what I'm saying is that that logic of geography applies as much to them. So in that respect, it is always going to be relevant. To my mind, it is more a question of capabilities, So if my adversary is coming with deeper pockets, with multi-billion projects, with no questions asked, my line of credit will simply be an option for them to fall back on, but definitely not their plan A. And I think that is what we need to worry about.
Namaskara, I'm Atmiya Kadamba. Thanks for your astonishing knowledge and experience coming to us. It's just our privilege. My question may be coming from a unique yet apt dimension. How internal security challenges or issues, redefining the narrative of neighborhood challenges, and what is Government of India's strategy towards it?
You're talking about internal security threats.
Internal security threats.
You're talking about basically externally fostered internal security
Exactly.
threats. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Would you like to respond?
Well, I think the government of India is very cognizant of what is happening, and we are following a strategy of, I would say, calibrated multi-alignment. You may or may not agree with me.
Strategic hedging.
Yeah. I wouldn't use the word hedging, because hedging implies that, you are hedging against insecurity. And I would say calibrated multi-alignment, India is still shaping outcomes. India is still showing and demonstrating leadership. So I would say calibrated multi-alignment. I mean, if you look at the G20, you look at the United Nations, you look at Global South initiatives, India is still assuming leadership positions. So I would not say we are strictly hedging. I would say it's a calibrated multi-alignment. So to answer your question, I think the government of India is very cognizant of this position. We are developing relations with all partners. You're aware of that. We have relations with the United States. We have a long and steady partnership with Russia. We are forging closer ties with the European Union. And as you know, for this Republic Day, the Costa von der Leyen duo is visiting India when a free trade agreement is expected to be signed. We have a historic relationship with the African Union. And across the board, of course, and how can we forget our neighbors? It's a neighborhood first policy. So I think India has ties, relations with all countries. It is actively involved. It is also involved in leadership initiatives. It is, I would say, therefore, following a very careful policy. And I think nothing is being left to chance. I think what you see unfold, because we've been part of the system, is a direct consequence of a strategy and a vision, and I think that is what we are seeing today, and that is what we will see, continue to see in the future. As far as the immediate neighborhood is concerned, all of us have agreed that India has intervened very rapidly in recent years, whether it's an earthquake or whether it's floods or anything. And I think the political leadership of the day has emphasized that you will see much more of this in the future on the part of India.
Thank you, ma'am. I just want to respond to your query with a very concrete example, since Ambassador was she was heading the mission in Bhutan. As of 2003, 2004, you had Ulfa militants take sanctuary in Bhutan. And that was neutralized in no time. Short answer to your question. Do you have anything more to add, or it will be more MEA-like?
No, no. We have to let the MA do their work, of course. Okay, so to a question on internal challenges and how to tackle, I'll give you a few examples, and how the decisions that we take internally sort of have these. I mean, of course, we all understand these are not watertight compartments. I'll tell you specific examples. So, for example, look at our big two defense partners, right? So we say Russia and France, right? But at the same time, how do you navigate a world where when you look at where your neighbor, Pakistan, who's very quickly, sometimes unbelievably, so actually I doubt the numbers, but unbelievably ramping up the manufacturing of the JF-17 fighter jets, all the three versions, and then the J-10Cs, etc. And they are supplying from Azerbaijan to Bangladesh to Sudan to Libya, I mean, and now to Saudi Arabia, perhaps. Now, that is a joint venture between Pakistan and China, but the engines for which are coming from Russia. Okay, how do you navigate that? Russia is our very stable defense partner. Now I'll give you another one and problematize it a bit for you. France. France. No. I'm just coming there. So when you come to France, now the problem is that what happened in Operation Sindoor, when you look at the commentary that came out on the BVR capabilities, etc., then you find out that Pakistan has been having access to the Electra suit, which is the electronic warfare suit that the Rafale uses, through all these French exports to Qatar and elsewhere, where it's basically the Pakistani pilots that are flying those planes there, both military and civilian. So how do you sort of delimitize, if you talk about the delimitation of the Rafale Club, how do you convince your partner? Because end of the day, these are private entities. Now, where the internal part comes is that what we can do, if we are able to take the right decisions in the right time, is that we can still get these things and we can still lessen our vulnerability if we are able to indigenize more and in time. So you have a situation where if you are able to take the right decisions, you are able to have some changes where you are not as vulnerable, okay? And the second thing is always about the satellite communication. Internally, if you have a neighbor sitting on you that is able to see where your deployments and installments are and sharing it real time with Pakistan, then there's very little that you can do if you don't have your own satellites up in space. So there is, of course, a seamless, but I gave you these two examples to show you that the decision, it's not just about internal problems, but it's also the lack of decision taking in time, which we 10 years later realize has put us in a vulnerable situation.
Yeah. 1 second, ma'am. Just to respond to your question, one more example. It is popularly or widely believed that Dawood Ibrahim is holed up somewhere in Karachi. Now, does the government of India have the muscle, covert muscle or overt muscle to extract him? It's $1 million question. The rumor is he's passed on because of comorbidities. Okay, so that would be more like your line of thinking. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Kindly.
Thanks.
She's asked first. You're a very popular face. Can you go ahead after that? Yeah.
Loud enough without a mic. Can I do that without a mic? Thank you so much. My question is to Dr. Rao. Ma'am, you spoke about multi-alignment in today's world and the reality of it. My question is with regard to Sri Lanka. You spoke about it through the context of Turkey. I'm looking at it through the context of Sri Lanka itself. What is the long-term geopolitical implications of multi-alignment for a country like Sri Lanka, which is almost geographically like a conduit between the West and the East, and historically has been like a lab for terror experiments? We've seen it with suicide bombers being replicated by the Chechen widows. We've seen, public transport being used as weapons of mass destruction. So my question is that, and then the challenges for maritime diplomacy, which has been greatly focused upon by this government. What does that mean when we engage with a country like Sri Lanka, and what are the challenges and where have we failed?
That's a very good question. May I know your name?
My name is
Mansi. No, Mansi, that's a very good question. See, it's not about failure. We have to sort of come out of the fact. It's not that we failed our neighborhood. I do not agree to and subscribe to such very sweeping sort of remarks. We have not done that. But since your question is on Sri Lanka, very quickly, of course, we all know what the fate of the BRI projects happen to be in Sri Lanka. And yet, even though right now we have a government that is sort of cozying up to India once again. But if you look into the details, they have already opened new vistas of cooperation with China again. And this is after the BRI, failure, so to say, and that financial crisis where basically India was the one that rose up to the occasion and not China. So that's what I'm saying, that for all these neighbors, when they look at big power, let's say, engagement, it is about capabilities. So for some reason, China continues to be their plan A, and we continue to be only their emergency, so to say, fallback. We are there for cushioning. If there is a problem, okay, India is going to be there with line of credit, India is going to be there as a first responder, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, etc., net security provider, or that we have recalibrated again now in 2025, we call it net security partner, whichever way you want to look at it. I think we have to make peace with the fact that unless the question of capabilities is resolved, this is going to be like that. What I mentioned again is that we have to understand that they also need diversification because they have seen the dangers of over-reliance on China. And that, I think, opens a very productive window for us. Apart from all the, correct, let's say, semantics, which is that, value, neighborhood, culture, of course, one. Two, capacity building. What Turkey does in Sri Lanka is those 6 warships that visited Sri Lanka all of 2025 didn't really get into submarine building and this and that. What they're doing is basic capacity building. Okay, if they're not able to sell anything new, they are helping with repair. If they are not able to sort of come up with path-breaking technologies, they are basically training their personnel and etc. So I think that is also something that India looks very seriously, which is capacity building. So capacitation of our neighborhood is also something where India is already there. The question is that in a very crowded space, how do you leverage your comparative advantage, which is also, like I said, a logic of geography, but then it's also a challenge of geography. So this is not going to go away anywhere. We have to keep our eyes and ears open. By the way, you must know that Sri Lanka, a small partner, only yesterday I was speaking to a very good Sri Lankan friend of mine, and she wanted to have a discussion with me, and she just wanted to read my thoughts on what I think about the situation. So you should know that there is a firm in Sri Lanka that now wants to invest in Venezuela. Why? Because US is pressurizing them. Now, these are all in the making. Nothing of this is actually, you will not read it in the headlines. But what I'm saying is that the world is going to be crowded and your neighborhood is going to be crowded. So we have to take the right decision at the right time and offer ourselves as reliable diversification partners, for which India has done a tremendous job. But it has to keep working at that.
No, I don't disagree with what you've said. In fact, I agree fully with what you've said. And building on a point, there's no doubt that you may not be able to match China's scale and speed, not to mention finance, but there is a case for sustainability. And India has been there. We are consistent, we are reliable, and we've been there. So I think that is very important. And I think, as I mentioned already to the gentleman who raised the question earlier, I think we have to keep up that consistency, that reliability, and that is precisely what India is doing in its neighborhood policy. So don't forget sustainability.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes,
Thanks.
I've seen you on social media so much. I'm happy to see you in person.
Right. Since we're talking about the neighborhood, my name is Smita, sorry. So since we're talking about the neighborhood, Swasti, you said that, SARC is, like, we don't need SARC, or SARC has become kind of defunct in the past couple of years because India has concentrated on other multilateral platforms like, say, maybe the BIMSTEC. But recently, there was this meeting, just a couple of weeks ago in Kunming. China quietly hosts Bangladesh and Pakistan. Bangladesh is one of those countries in SARC, and Pakistan especially. These are countries which have been wanting China to enter SARC for a long time. And China happily hosts this meeting in Kunming, trying to get it edgeways. Many of the countries in SARC have been anxious, irritable with India not concentrating on SARC. We've been having bilateral relationships with these countries, yes, but they don't like the idea that SARC has been held hostage to India-Pakistan problems. Now, if China comes in with all the paraphernalia that they bring in, pretending that there are no ties attached, are we going to be just sitting and watching while they hijack SARC? Ma'am Kamboj, if you could also talk about this.
Okay, no, that's great because you're right. I mean, we were all very concerned about the fact that China could be actually, putting together a new SAARC minus India. So the possibility of that is pretty high, and especially if you see the economic and financial sort of investments that China has made in the region, the defense industry engagements that China has made in the region. So you're right. So I think the question that I was trying to basically answer, and the point that I was trying to put across, is that the problem with international organizations is that we have to decide what drives what. So there are two ways in which you can basically put together international organizations. Either the function can drive the form, which is, at least so far, Quad was given as a good example of function driving form. So you don't have a headquarters, you don't have a secretariat, but because the convergence of interest is so high, so that it develops a life of its own. That, again, under Donald Trump is under question, so I am fully aware of that, but at least, so the function could drive form, or the form could drive function. I think with SAARC, what happened was that we wanted the form, which is the structure, to drive the function, and it couldn't happen that way. I think the larger point I was trying to make is that if it is not working, then India definitely should come out with something new, something which is more innovative, instead of waiting for China to come and take over the neighborhood. But just in terms of how the SAARC structure is, yes, there are problems. And another example, SCO, for example. India is very much a part of SCO because that is important to our connectivity to Central Asia and beyond. But the fact is that SCO, the regional anti-terrorist structure, which is the permanent structure within the SCO, is not really able to cater anything to India's terrorist, terror-related problems with Pakistan, because Pakistan is a member there. So while the RATS is able to sort of deliver to Russia, to China in terms of the Khorasan and the Khorasan province, Al-Qaeda affiliates that are there, it is not really helping India. So what I'm just trying to say is that if what we have right now is not able to help, we should certainly be innovative. There is no doubt about that. Yeah, but SAARC per se, I see little probability.
Yeah, I think, Smita, your question was, what can India do under such a circumstance? Well, to be very honest, the short answer is you have a couple of options. One is that you can work through your friends in South Asia to do something about this matter, this new formation coming into being. And I think it is no secret here that very often in the past, India has done so. There has been pressure upon us in the past 10 years in particular to revive SAARC. We are all aware of that. And there were moments when we were perhaps reasonably close to convening another SAARC summit, but there are ways of going about this. So I think in response to your specific question, you can still use those levers. My second point here is that, look, this is an era of minilaterals. These issue-based coalitions. There are so many. By one count, there are at least some 20 active issue-based coalitions in the world today. So, I mean, countries are experimenting various combinations, and it's quite possible that another one could be formed. Or, talking about innovation, which is what Swasti was mentioning, India could also form another minilateral in response. So I think there are various ways of dealing about this, but one thing I can assure you, that surely India would be aware of this, the government would be aware of this development.
If I can just add on, I just had to give a lecture in Delhi the other day, a couple of weeks ago, on BIMSTEC. I think the biggest threat to subcontinental security has got to do with the Rohingya refugees, about 1 million of them in Bangladesh, and Pakistan is busy arming them and fighting the Arakan army. So that is what we got to worry about. The last time we got into a big blow-up was when the Bangladeshi refugees came in here, and that led to a war. Now, how we handle the Rohingya refugees and how it pans out remains to be seen. Thank you very much for your questions and participation. You've been a very nice audience. Yeah. Oh, I hope so. Can I just, I'm supposed to summarize the wisdom of their words. So I'll take a couple of minutes as part of the vote of thanks or whatever formality there is to be done with. So the ambassador spoke about the subcontinent and how, it goes beyond geography and data and AI and technology and the weaponization of interdependence. and how very interestingly, how extra-regional powers are already embedded in the region of South Asia, and how the Ministry of External Affairs addressed Parliament for the first time directly, and how the Bangladesh domestic dynamics became an international issue. And then a very interesting example she gave from her experience as the ambassador in Bhutan was how Bhutan is a sort of counter-narrative to the rest of the neighborhood, which is fairly anti-Indian. The other day in Delhi, my former colleague who specialized in the neighborhood was saying, whether I'm in Pakistan or Nepal, I don't know which country is more anti-Indian. That's the state of affairs. And then, of course, the ambassador talked about India's need to deliver, partner, and also the very unique concept of triangular cooperation. And then Dr. Swasti Rao very interestingly spoke about what is in management jargon commonly called VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And she spoke about 2% of India's defense spending being part of the GDP. Is that right? I mean, I've reported on the defense budget long enough in my days as a military correspondent, and I'm very taken aback. I'm out of touch that it's only 2%. Normally, the rule of thumb is defense spending should not exceed 4% of GDP. And then Dr. Swasti Rao came up with a very interesting expression, global militarization. When you talk about Russia, Ukraine, and the turmoil in West Asia, global militarization, and how it is sort of kicked in closer home with Operation Sindoor, just about a few months, 6-7 months old. And then she spoke about a very interesting concept of cross-cutting of defense supply chains. That is, she was talking about integration of subsystems, right? I mean, basically, if you look at a fighter aircraft upgrade, it's more the avionics which makes all the difference. Or any missile system, it's the avionics, not the hardware, so to say. And she was talking about the JF-17, the fighters, the Sino-Pakistan fighters being made in Takshila, heavy aircraft, the Pakistan's facility, aeronautics facility. And then Dr. Swasti Rao spoke about technology linkage. And she made a reference to Afghanistan having a thriving shadow economy. And lastly, how India's borders need to be secured. And then the need to focus on Turkey, something which is new to me, how Turkey is a supplier of military hardware, maybe high-tech military hardware to China and Pakistan both. And more interestingly, she concluded with something like what is called internal bandwagoning, where India needs to, reform its internal bureaucracy. To what extent, I don't know whether the ambassador will agree or disagree, do we have a whole of government approach to the neighborhood? That's the moot point. It shouldn't ruffle too many feathers. So all that note, I will wind up and conclude. Thank you very much once again. Thank the organizers for having us here.
That concludes a session marked by strategic depth and regional insight. We now request the presentation of token of appreciation to our moderators. I request Captain Brijesh Chauta, Managing Trustee, Bharat Foundation, to present a memento to the dignitaries.